Today, 7th June, is the day following the commemorations in France of the D-Day landings, which took place in June 1944, and which played a role in the eventual collapse of the German dictatorship that had exercised sway over Europe for the first half of the 1940s. A dictatorship whose extraordinary brutality and cruelty, well, it would be superfluous to discuss on a programme like this. The commemoration was interesting in that Russia, which played by far the single greatest contribution to the Allied victory of the Second World War, was not invited to participate, whereas Ukraine, which of course participated in the Second World War as a component republic of the Soviet Union, and which had no independent existence at that time, was, more interestingly, some of the political speeches, including President Biden's speeches, made what I thought were singularly inappropriate parallels between the situation in the world today and the situation in June 1944. I myself would have felt far more comfortable if a commemoration of this kind, which does commemorate an important event in the history of the Second World War, but only one event amongst others which were arguably at least as important, the Soviet victory in Stalingrad, for example, or the Soviet victory at the Battle of Kursk, just to give a few examples. And one could find other events of the Second World War that took place in China as well, which arguably were of equal importance. Anyway, events like that in the West received no attention at all. I think it would have been far more appropriate and far more proper, including proper towards the few remaining veterans of the D-Day landings, to use these events to speak about world peace, to talk about the need for nations to come together, to talk principally about common humanity, the kind of shared humanity that all nations have. The rather confrontational speeches, the very political speeches, including the one that was made by the United States President at this event, seemed to me frankly unhelpful. Now, there is one observer to these events, observer who is, of course, a major participant in the Second World War, but is at the same time a remote observer to events which took place in Europe, and that is China. Now, China's role in the Second World War is one that is consistently, massively underreported in the West, to an even greater extent than the Soviet contribution to the Allied victory in the Second World War is. Suffice to say that the two countries that suffered by far the heaviest losses in the defeat of the Axis powers over the course of the Second World War were the Soviet Union and China, which is something which I think might surprise many Westerners, even though it is a massive and incontrovertible fact. Anyway, the Chinese have been observing these commemorations in Normandy, and Global Times newspaper, which, as we know, to a great extent reflects the opinions of the Chinese authorities published an editorial, and I'm going to read the opening paragraph because I think it actually captures the reality of the commemoration which took place yesterday. The opening paragraph reads as follows. On June 6th, the 80th anniversary commemoration of the Normandy landings, often referred to as D-Day, was held in the coastal region of Vers-sur-Mer, Calvados, France, with over 20 Western leaders in attendance. Although this significant commemorative event is likely to be recorded in history as the last quinquennial or decennial anniversary surviving veterans participated, some commentators suggested that this commemoration has garnered more attention due to the heightened international tensions. The high-profile guests and politically charged speeches at the event, intertwined with increasingly geopolitical content, have led some to question whether this is a genuine commemorative event or a mobilization campaign under the guise of unity. I have to say, I think Global Times has got it this time exactly right. I express my sorrow about this. I repeat again that I do not believe that this is the correct way either to remember the events of 80 years ago or to remember the sacrifices that were made on those events 80 years ago, or to honour the few surviving veterans that are left. But that, my own feeling as well, is what happened. A mobilisation campaign more than a genuine commemoration. Let's move on and let's turn to the event which overshadows and dominates the geopolitical situation today. And that is, of course, the conflict in Ukraine. And, well, here again, we've had more news from the battlefronts. And as is now always the way, the situation on the battlefronts continues to go badly for Ukraine. The Russians continue their offensive. They continue their advance. The United States continues to pump weapons into Ukraine. They're announcing another $225 million package of aid for Ukraine. They are burning through the $13.8 billion in aid promised to Ukraine, well, allocated to Ukraine as a result of that congressional vote, which took place, I believe now it was about 6 weeks ago. They're burning through it very fast. And anyway, that is what they continue to do. But so far, there is little sign, in fact, there's no real sign, that is changing anything of importance on the battlefronts. For the record, I noticed that the latest allocation, which I anxiously wait Brian Beletic's assessment of, that the latest allocation again refers to supplies of HIMARS missiles. I suspect that this does include items like the rockets which launch the small diameter bombs and the conventional guided HIMARS rockets. But I suspect references to HIMARS ammunition, resupplies for HIMARS, now also covers ATACMS missiles, which continue to be launched by Ukraine increasingly widely across the battlefronts. Now, interestingly, over the last couple of days, I've seen less signs of Ukraine launching strikes on Crimea or on Russian targets in the Black Sea. I wonder whether that might be connected with problems that US surveillance drones are having in that area. That's a question. It's not. It's a genuine question. It's not, a hint that that is indeed what is happening. I mean, I simply do not know. A couple of days ago, there was, as I said, some rather strange manoeuvres by US drones, which I've not seen a complete explanation for. I've speculated, and I want to stress again, it's mere speculation that this might have been a result of Russian jamming, but I admit I do not know. And it might be a leap too far, in fact, it is a leap too far, to say that these odd manoeuvres of the drones somehow explain the lack of ATACMS strikes and Storm Shadow and Scalp strikes on targets in Crimea and in the Black Sea. I mean, there might be a connection, but we don't know that there is. But anyway, the ATACMS have not disappeared from the battlefronts. They were used again last night. 5 were launched towards Lugansk region. 4 were shot down by Russian air defense. 1 got through and struck a building in Lugansk, which the Russians say was a civilian building, and they're saying that 20 people were wounded, were injured in the attack, including 1 child who was 8 years old. That's what the Russians say. Well, I've no reason to doubt this report. It might be that with large numbers of ATACMS missiles have been shot down over Crimea, the Ukrainians and their American assistants have decided to change the focus onto what they might think are less defended targets. The air defense systems, the Russian air defense systems in the Crimea and Black Sea and Krasnodar areas being extremely dense. So it might be that they've decided, therefore, to shift the focus towards Lugansk, or it might be that there's just more ATACMS missiles and that they have more ATACMS missiles, and that's why they're now broadening the scope of their attacks. But anyway, the Russians say that they managed to shoot down 4. 1, however, got through and did the damage which it did. Anyway, that's one example of further escalation. The United States agreeing to another big military aid package for Ukraine. President Zelensky is now heading to France, where he's meeting with President Macron. President Macron, who at the start of the war seemed to be the moderate amongst Western leaders, has now switched to becoming the extreme hardliner. In fact, his tone has been getting increasingly hysterical over the last couple of months. Anyway, yesterday he gave another very aggressive interview to the French media. He again spoke about instructors being sent to Ukraine, about those instructors training a Ukrainian brigade of 4,800 men, which will be, by the way, substantially the biggest brigade in the Ukrainian army, if it ever reaches that sort of figure. I wonder what equipment, by the way, it will have. Will it be supplied with equipment from France? Will Macron make the decision to supply Ukraine with France's Leclerc tanks, which up to now France has refused to supply to Ukraine? Just asking. I mean, that is the logic, perhaps, of the decision to train and build up a brigade like this. Of course, training a brigade from the start logically should take months. But of course, it's likely that that training has been underway already for quite a long time. And I, for one, would not be surprised if we saw this brigade, perhaps with French weapons, appearing on the battlefronts at some point over the next few weeks. Now, a brigade of 4,800 men might sound like a powerful force, a powerful unit in the Ukrainian military, and of course it is. But it's important to remember that President Putin says that Ukraine is losing the equivalent of 50,000 men a month. 50,000 men a month. And that brigade, therefore, is, well, it amounts to just 10% of the losses that Ukraine would normally suffers in a month. It would perhaps be better trained, better equipped, and certainly larger than other brigades, other Ukrainian brigades. But as we have seen, the reality is that Ukraine burns through its manpower and its equipment at a speed which simply is irreplaceable. And I think I've now had the opportunity to read more carefully Putin's statements about this, about Ukrainian losses, which he made over the course of his meeting with the news agencies. And I think that they have been slightly misinterpreted. This is my own view. I think he was, to some extent, being rather vague about the figures. But I think overall the point that he was making is that the mobilization, which is enlisting 30,000 men a month, isn't covering Ukraine's total losses, which currently stand at around 50,000 men a month. So the Ukrainian army is indeed getting smaller. There was some attempts to make distinctions between irreplaceable and sanitary losses, which Putin said were 50-50. I think people ran away with the idea that he meant by that the sanitary losses are losses of people who are lightly wounded and who therefore immediately return to the battlefronts. I think that is a misunderstanding. I think that the irreplaceably wounded are those who are so badly wounded they've lost limbs or whatever, and they can never return to the battle. The ones who are the sanitary wounded are those who are probably quite badly wounded, but who might at some point recover from their wounds and might return eventually to the battle lines, but that could take weeks or months before it happens. That is my own understanding of this rather complicated language that Putin uses. And I personally think that's my assessment of it. But anyway, one way or the other, I don't think that this new French brigade, well, it's going to make a difference, but hardly a decisive difference, given the losses that Ukraine is already experiencing. So, Macron talks about the instructors, he talks about the training up of the brigade, and he reveals something which I'm now going to say I was already aware of because one of my sources has been telling me about it for some time. I didn't want to discuss it too much because I was worried that this might, to some extent, say something about the kind of information this source has. But anyway, Macron revealed that France intends to supply Mirage 2005 fighter jets to Ukraine as well. Now, the Mirage 2000, I remember it very well. It was very widely displayed in air shows. Was the French equivalent. It was a French aircraft fighter jet that was developed at roughly the same time that the Soviet MiG-29 and the US F-16 were developed, which was at the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s. And in generational terms, it firmly belongs to that class of aircraft. And France equipped itself with quite a number of these Mirage 2000s. But I think it is fair to say that it was primarily seen by France as a fighter jet for export. And it was exported quite widely, as I remember, in the 1970s and 1980s to all sorts of countries around the world. The UAE bought quite a few. Greece, as I remember, bought some. Other countries bought some as well. India was a significant, though not in the end, huge buyer. In the end, they focused more on Russian Sukhoi 30s. Just saying. But anyway, it must be considered overall as something of an export success. But by the late 80s, early 90s, it's beginning to become clear that it was unable to keep up with the latest technical advances of the F-16s, especially, which were the main competitor, and perhaps some of the late Soviet fighters, the more advanced versions of the MiG-29 and of the Sukhoi 27. So the French did a redesign of its electronics, its systems, its battlefield systems. And the result was that we got the Mirage 2000-5. And again, I can remember that this was quite widely displayed and in air shows. Now, to the best of my memory, and I'm talking about events of long ago, it did not sell particularly well. And the French were left with a number that they couldn't find customers for. And though it was not really intended so much for the French Air Force, that I'm now talking from memory, and many people will no doubt come back and push back on this. But anyway, I remember that the French did in the end, basically in order to scoop up production. Again, I speak from memory now, but I seem to remember that some of these aircraft were not actually entirely new versions, but rather refurbished versions of old Mirage 2000s. Anyway, the French acquired around a score of these Mirage 2000s, these new, more advanced Mirage 2005s, which, as I said, did not sell, as I remember, particularly well in the international arms markets. And as I understand it, they served with the French Air Force ever since, though with the introduction of the far more modern and successful Rafale fighter, no doubt France has been looking to dispose of them. So it can't export them, it could scrap them, but why not send them off to Ukraine, where they will give President Macron an opportunity to say that he is assisting the Ukrainians by providing them with fighter jets. And as I said, this source told me that this was going to happen some months ago, as I remember, and it turns out that it has. And the Ukrainian pilots have been in France for quite a long time, training on these aircraft. And interestingly, I am told that these are pilots from Ukraine who previously operated Sukhoi 25 ground attack aircraft. Now, it's curious because, again, and I'm speaking now from recollections of events long ago. I remember that the Mirage 2000 was always marketed as principally an air-to-air fighter. Anyway, I'm going to make a guess that the idea is to supply the entire stock of 20 or 30 Mirage 2000s. As I said, these are aircraft from the early 1990s. I'm not suggesting that they are completely ineffective or that they won't pose the Russians some problems. But anyway, I suspect that the French intend to supply their entire stockpile of these fighters to Ukraine. It's a good way of disposing of them, or at least the French will see it as a good way of disposing of them. And, well, I don't think that they are remotely up to challenging the far more modern and far more powerful Sukhoi 35s and Sukhoi 30s of the Russian Air Force, not to mention the new Sukhoi 57 stealth fighter jets and the MiG-31s. But they will have a role. They will supplement the Ukrainian Air Force. And I wonder whether this is what Macron is thinking. Maybe they could operate as carriers for the Scalp missiles, the subsonic cruise missiles, which are the French version of the Storm Shadows, the British Storm Shadows. And maybe these missiles could then be used by the Ukrainians to launch strikes against targets inside Russia. Very dangerous, very reckless game that Macron is playing. Again, one which, if it's what he's thinking, will cross Russian red lines. And these are real red lines. But given how reckless and recklessly aggressive he has become, it wouldn't surprise me at all. It's exactly the kind of stupid thing that he might be thinking of doing. And of course, it's important to say that if these fighter jets have been converted or adapted to launch Storm Shadows or Scalp missiles, and by the way, I'm not certain that they have been, and I'm not certain that they can, but I presume they can. But if that is the idea, then this idea has clearly been in the works for a very long time indeed, going back probably to the late autumn or perhaps even the summer of last year, when it was becoming clear that Ukraine's great summer offensive was going to end in failure. Because that is the amount of time it would take to train Ukrainian pilots to use these aircraft. Just saying. Now, the F-16 is a tricky aircraft to operate, as has been discussed by many people. They don't take off from any runway. The runway needs to be clean and swept and tidy and well prepared. Once upon a time, long ago, when I knew a little bit more about these things than I do now, I remember that an earlier Mirage fighter jet, the Mirage 3, French fighter jet, Mirage 3, used by the Israelis to decisive effect during the Six-Day War, well, that fighter jet apparently could take off from shorter, rougher runways than the F-16 apparently can do. The Mirage 2000 bears some superficial resemblance to the Mirage 3. Both are delta-winged aircraft. I don't know what that does, by the way. Whether that means that the Mirage 3 can operate from rougher runways than the F-16s can, I have no idea. But as I've said previously in other programs, and as the BBC recently admitted, deploying aircraft sufficiently close to the Russian border in order to enable them to launch missiles into Russia is a one-way ticket for the pilot. The very dense, very advanced Russian air defense system will have no difficulty tracking those aircraft. Mirage 2000s are certainly not stealth aircraft. The Russians will be on the lookout for them, and I suspect they will shoot most of them down pretty fast, if that is indeed what they are intended to be used for. Of course, there is the other possibility mentioned by that source that I spoke about, of using the Mirage 2000s to try to create air defences around the so-called Iron Triangle cities, the cities around the Dnieper, which are intended to be which might eventually become rather the main Ukrainian fallback defense lines on the west bank of the Dnieper: Odessa, Kryvyi Rog, Zaporozhye, Dnipro. Well, it might be that they will be used in that way rather than, as I said, as long-range strike aircraft. We'll just have to wait and see. But one thing I am sure, they will not change the situation on the battlefronts. So we see escalation taking place, but not of a sort that is going to shift, in the end, the situation on the battlefronts, that is going to change the trajectory of the war. Now, I do want to address a point that's been made to me by a recent correspondent on the question of Russian red lines. I made a point before, and I want to make it, and I stand by it, that since the start of the special military operation in February 2022, Western governments, Western commentators have repeatedly bragged that Western powers have crossed Russian red lines in terms of the types of weapons they've supplied to Ukraine, and that the Russians have never responded. They've never enforced their red lines in the way that they said that they would do. Only that, as I have pointed out many occasions now, the actual truth is that these various red lines that the Western powers, in terms of weapons that they've supplied to Ukraine, have crossed, have never actually, up to this time, in fact, crossed any real Russian red lines. The Russians have never at any time said, for example, that supplying Western tanks or Western fighter jets or HIMARS missiles or artillery shells or uranium or depleted uranium shells to Ukraine was for Russia a red line. I keep very careful track of what the Russians are saying, have been saying. Nor, by the way, did they ever say that missile or bomb attacks on Crimea or on Donbass, on the four regions, in other words, was for Russia also a red line. As far as the Russians are concerned, all of these territories since September of 2022 are Russian. And of course, in the case of Crimea, Crimea has been Russian since March 2014. However, Russian sovereignty over these regions has not been internationally recognized, not to any wide degree. And the Russians have always known that they would be operating beyond world opinion, the support of world opinion, if they made a huge play of Ukrainian attacks or Western supported Ukrainian attacks on positions in, say, Crimea as Russian territory. They might find it hard to rally international support if they were to make that kind of claim. So they never have done. And what has been happening is that the Western powers have at various times said to themselves that they're not going to cross particular red lines, which they have agreed amongst each other, that they wouldn't supply tanks. I can remember Boris Johnson back in March 2022 saying that it made no sense to supply Ukraine with heavy tanks. I remember him saying it. Anyway, Western powers have repeatedly set out red lines about things that they would not supply to Ukraine, and always and invariably they have crossed them. They have crossed every red line, every restriction that they placed upon themselves. And then, of course, as night follows day, the commentariat turns round and pretends that these red lines, which were Western red lines the West imposed on itself, were actually Russian. And that the fact that the Russians haven't responded proves that they don't, in fact, enforce their red lines. Now, that has accustomed a lot of people in the West into thinking that the Russians do not enforce their red lines. This completely false narrative that has been created. It is obviously untrue. As Putin has himself pointed out in the past, the very fact that there is a conflict going on in Ukraine at the present time, that the Russian army is fighting in Ukraine, that there is a special military operation underway in Ukraine, is because the Western powers and Ukraine crossed Russian red lines, over the ultimate question of NATO membership for Ukraine, crossed Russian red lines over the possible installation of Western ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads in Ukraine. Lavrov has recently given an interview in which he claimed that in January 2022, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken all but admitted to him that the United States did indeed intend at some point to install ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads in Ukraine once Ukraine became a part of NATO. And of course, the West and NATO, as the Russians repeatedly claim, or at least as Putin repeatedly claims, crossed Russian red lines over the situation in Donbass. It is now universally acknowledged that there was no intention on the part of Ukraine ever to implement the Minsk agreement. The Ukrainians are now absolutely open about that. Western governments are absolutely open about the fact that they went along with this. And of course, the Russians also claim that in February 2022, the Ukrainians were shelling Donbass, which, by the way, is also true. It was confirmed by the OSCE, and that they were preparing a further attack on Donbass, a military attack on Donbass, which the Russians say was also a red line. So the Russians responded to all of that, and that is why we have a special military operation now. But the West, having repeatedly claimed that it has crossed Russian red lines, without provoking a reaction from the Russians, even though that is not true, has now become increasingly accustomed to believing this, to believing this narrative that it has created for itself. And the fact is that we are now at the very edge. We've reached the very edge of an actual Russian red line, which the Russians say must not be crossed. And that red line is the one concerning the launch of cruise missiles into Russian territory. And the Russians, President Putin and others, have been saying that this red line is real and that it must not be crossed, but the Western powers, having repeatedly crossed their own red lines and pretended to themselves that these were Russian red lines, now show a very cavalier attitude altogether to red lines in general, be it their own or Russian ones. And if I'm right, and if Macron is gradually edging towards the situation where Mirage fighter jets start launching Scalp missiles directly into Russia, well, we're going to be crossing that red line very soon. It'll be interesting to see what the Americans say. President Biden has now come out again and has said clearly that as far as he is concerned, the only authority he has given to the Ukrainians is to launch counterstrikes against Russian forces in the Kharkiv area in connection with the Ukrainian offensive in that area. But I get the sense that the administration is far too divided and conflicted to rein Macron in the way that they should. But anyway, put that aside, the fact is that the Western powers, I am convinced, having, as I said, repeatedly crossed their own red lines, having claimed to themselves that those red lines were Russian, and having taken a cavalier attitude to red lines, sooner or later they're going to cross the actual Russian one. And the Russians are going to respond. The latest Russian official to say as much is the Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov. He's made some comments to this effect. I believe at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. Putin spoke about this again in his own comments to the news agencies. But I don't think that Western governments and Western leaders, and certainly not Macron, are paying as much attention as they should. Anyway, there we are. So escalation goes on, and, well, there's been a very fine article about all of this, this constant Western escalation by Stephen Bryan at Asia Times. And he says this, that NATO flirting with war and extinction in Ukraine. And the subtitle reads, NATO leaders fear Ukraine's collapse, but inserting NATO troops in small numbers is no solution, whilst deep strike authorization invites disaster. And I completely agree. And Stephen Bryan, who, by the way, got a lot of stick when he discussed about a few weeks ago the deployment of French troops in Ukraine, I think we can increasingly see that that report in substance was correct, despite attempts to pretend otherwise. But anyway, Stephen Bryan makes the point that the Ukrainian military is actually close to collapse, that all of these actions that the Western powers are taking are symptoms of Western panic about the prospect of Ukraine's collapse. Now, panic is my word. It's not Stephen Bryan's. But as I said, I've much experience of panic. I used to see it in action many, many times in my previous career. So I know how it works. And as I said already, I can smell it whenever it happens. But anyway, this is what Stephen Bryan says. NATO leaders fear Ukraine's collapse, whilst they are guessing what the Russians will do next. They are largely out of options to save Ukraine. Inserting NATO soldiers in relatively small numbers is not a solution. It only means that Europe will soon be filled with body bags. I completely agree with all the resulting political reaction, by the way, that will cause. And then he goes on to say, NATO does not want to negotiate with Russia. That goes especially for President Biden, who fears going into coming elections, having lost Afghanistan and Ukraine. Any deal with the Russians today would mean major concessions, not only on territory, but about Ukraine's future, which is, of course, true. That's absolutely correct. But then, who has brought us to this point? Western policy has. But anyway, let's stick with what Stephen Bryan is saying. And then Stephen Bryan says this: Russia has not changed its red line in demanding that NATO get out of Ukraine. Whilst the Russians might agree to some security guarantees for Ukraine, it is hard to see how such guarantees have trading value. Would the United States go to war with Russia for Ukraine? The answer is no. We've seen that already. The only solid and proven military force in NATO is the United States. But the US force, and remember, Stephen Bryan is a former senior Pentagon official. He knows what he's talking about. The US force is mainly expeditionary and small, no match for a Russian land army. And then he refers to the example of what happens to expeditionary forces. He cites the example of what happened to the British expeditionary force that was sent to Europe to fight the Germans in 1940 and ended up having to be evacuated from Dunkirk. And then he says this: the American advantage is in tactical aviation, but again, US pilots would have to operate in a dense area denial environment where Russian air defenses could reduce US tactical aviation effectiveness. It is quite true that the United States has stealth, but the Russians have been working on ways to counter US stealth fighters, such as the F-22 and F-35. And of course, they've been doing it since the 1980s. In fact, people tend to forget. No one can say for sure how far along Russia is on being able to target American stealth platforms, but Russian strategic defenses are using UHF and L-band radars to make sure they're neither surprised nor incapable of handling stealth threats. And this brings us to the Voronezh radars. And Stephen Bryan wonders whether the attacks on the Voronezh radars, the one at Armavir and the other at Orsk, was connected possibly to a US stealth fighter jet offensive against Russia. I don't believe so, by the way. I mean, those attacks were far too minimal to really be about that. And then he goes on to say this: the new US policy on strikes inside Russian territory appears to be limited to counter-battery strikes in the Kharkiv area. The other significant limitation is that the US will not allow ATACMS missiles to be fired into Russian territory. The Russians say that the US policy is largely meaningless because US and NATO weapons are already being used on Russian territory, which is true. And then Stephen Bryan says this: striking deep in Russia sounds like an attractive military option, but it is far from clear such attacks can change the course of the war in Ukraine. The best option Ukraine has in trying to push back the Russians is the use of drones. And Stephen Bryan makes the astonishing point, which is, by the way, completely true, which is that the bulk of the drones that Ukraine has been using are adaptations of Chinese drones that Ukraine buys in massive quantities. And we've been hearing a huge amount about supplies of weapon systems by China to Russia, whereas the reality is that the only side that's actually using in direct combat Chinese systems on a mass scale in the war in Ukraine is Ukraine, which is using Chinese drones. And Stephen Bryan says it is noteworthy that the Chinese keep selling them to the Ukrainians, even though their friend and ally is Russia. It is also interesting that the Russians say nothing about it. But anyway, that's a story for another day. And he then finishes that the Russians could retaliate if this situation continues, and that the Western powers do cross Russian red lines, by launching deep strikes with missiles against Russia. And he says that if this were to happen, that would instantly expand the war to Europe, a policy shift Putin has so far resisted. But then he says this, the likely result of all this is that the Ukraine war will continue. NATO will take even more losses, including NATO soldiers. Behind the scenes, plans to use air power or NATO ground forces are unlikely to be implemented, given the dire consequences for Europe. NATO's flirtation with a bigger war is horribly risky, as serious thinkers in Europe and the United States realize. Spooking the Russians to back off by attacking Russian territory or sending in French soldiers will not work, as the Russians have already priced in that reality and are ploughing ahead with the war in Ukraine. NATO's failure to negotiate over Ukraine means the bleeding out of NATO's already limited capabilities will continue. Some NATO states may decide they need to look elsewhere for security. Is NATO flirting with extinction? Now, I think Stephen Bryan's analysis is absolutely spot on. All of these schemes, missile strikes on Russia, incredibly dangerous, violating Russian red lines, triggering Russian responses, and we can already see the Russians talking about supplying military technologies, advanced military technologies to enemies of the West, and specifically of the United States around the world. Well, we can already see how that is already being done. But what makes all of these schemes so disastrous, so massively inconceived, is that they cannot win the war for Ukraine. They cannot defeat Russia in Ukraine. They can only increase the extent of Russia's eventual victory, and above all, of NATO's eventual defeat, as well as putting the West in an even more dangerous overall geopolitical position. And, well, what about that point that Stephen Bryan makes? Some NATO countries may decide they need to look elsewhere for security. Is NATO flirting with extinction? Now, this article by Stephen Bryan was written on the 3rd of June. I've only managed to come round to it now because there's been so much else to discuss. But if I am right, this article was written, in fact, it must have been written, before we saw Turkey's announcement that it now wants to join the BRICS. And of course, other countries that might be looking to join the BRICS eventually, we can start to think which those countries might be. Hungary, Slovakia, Serbia, which of course is not yet a member of NATO, other states in the Balkans. Not impossible. Not only is Stephen Bryan's article correct, it also looks prescient. Now, that's one article I want to discuss today. There is another article by the former British diplomat, Ian Pound. Now, Ian Pound is somebody that I should say I've recently met in London and who we've also interviewed on the Duran, Glenn Deason and myself, and whom I look forward to interviewing again soon. But anyway, he talks about this bizarre conference in Switzerland, the so-called Peace Conference. I've discussed in my last programme how it really seems to have been more than anything, more than an actual peace conference, that its real purpose seems to have been to reaffirm Zelensky's legitimacy as president of Ukraine, a stamp of approval for his legitimacy from world leaders that Zelensky most emphatically needs, given that following the cancellation of elections and the expiry of his term, question marks are now being made against his right to remain Ukraine's president. But consider this point that Ian Pound is making in this article. Indeed, the Swiss government, which is hosting this conference, refers to it as the Summit on Peace in Ukraine. Although it isn't clear that Switzerland is in charge, as most of the press reporting about invitations appears to issue from Zelensky's office. So this raises a diplomatic question as to the precise scope of the event itself. Summits are normally hosted by the countries in which they take place. Those countries shape the agenda and try to steer a communique that represents the best outcome of what can be agreed among the parties. In this case, there appears to be a diplomatic tug-of-war between the Swiss and the Ukrainians about who is running the show. Well, the mystery, the question that Ian Pound poses, is immediately solved if we accept that the people who are running the show ultimately are the Ukrainians, obviously with the backing of the Western powers, and that the purpose of the conference, more than anything else, even more than isolating the Russians and presenting them with some kind of ultimatum, something which obviously isn't going to happen, was to give the stamp of legitimacy to Zelensky and to Ukraine, and to Zelensky as president of Ukraine. And, well, there we are. It's not worked, and it isn't working, because this isn't really a peace conference at all. It's a conference thought up, conjured up by the Western powers with the Ukrainians to a great extent themselves running the show, as they try not only to mobilize as much world opinion as they can behind Zelensky's peace formula, but also try to get him consecrated by world leaders as the leader of Ukraine. And in pound finishes, the event in Switzerland is shaping up to be another echo chamber for an increasingly boorish Zelensky to publicly hector countries that don't agree with his deluded and completely unsupportable position. It is time for real peace talks with Russia to begin. Well, of course, Ian Pound is right. He's absolutely correct also. Before I continue, I should say that it was Jeff Roberts, again, eminent British historian, who brought this article to my attention, and I'd like to express my debt to him. But anyway, here we see, again, the true purpose, the who is really running the show in Lucerne, Zelensky, and we can see also who is seeking, what he is seeking to achieve in Lucerne. And as Ian Pound says, why do people go along with it? Isn't it better to begin real peace talks with the Russians as soon as possible, rather than continue to indulge in these pointless schemes? Well, there we go. Let's now turn to the situation on the battlefronts. The situation in the Kharkiv region is extremely interesting, or at least what makes it interesting, at least for me, is, as I said, the very interesting information that Russian group of forces north gives us about the situation in Kharkiv region, which, as I said, is of a level of detail that you simply do not find from any other of the groups of forces that the Russian military has operating in the conflict zone. And I wonder why that is, by the way. One can come up with various explanations, but anyway, this is the latest report from this website, Northwind, which probably, almost certainly is a website run by Group of Forces North. And it says this: on June 6th, Group of Forces North continued the liberation of the border areas of Kharkiv region. In the Volchansk direction, fierce fighting continues in Volchansk. Assault units of Group of Forces North, with heavy fighting, are advancing deep into the territory of the aggregate plant. This is, in other words, they're advancing inside the industrial zone, which is one of the two areas of Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, which the Ukrainians still control. The other is the area of the high-rise buildings, which some people refer to as the citadel. In the east of the city, the Group of Forces North advanced another 200 meters to the south. So the Russians continuing to occupy more and more of northern Volchansk. And then, interestingly, Group of Forces North tells us this: there are no significant changes in the neighborhood of the high-rise buildings. So in the citadel area, the Russians over the last 24 hours have not made any progress. Interesting admission from a military force. And then Group of Forces North goes on to tell us that the total advance of Russian troops in the Volchansk direction amounted to 340 meters, which in dense urban areas is actually quite a lot. And then Group of Forces North, Northwind, this website goes on to tell us this: on the Liptovsky direction, in other words in Lipsy, unexpectedly for the enemy, in other words the Ukrainians, the assault detachments of Group of Forces North made a swift raid on a Ukrainian stronghold in the forest area west of the village of Zelenoye, defeated the enemy and occupied the dominant heights. Enemy counterattacks resulted in nothing but senseless casualties in the amount of 10 killed. The total advance of the Russian troops in Lipy amounted to 600 meters. And that's an interesting new piece of information, because up to now the fighting around Lipy has been relatively quiet and appeared to be deadlocked. But even as Group of Forces North, the Russians continue their advance, their incremental and methodical capture of Volchansk, they've also made a sudden swoop on Ukrainian positions in the Lipy area and have gained control of some actual important positions. And then the North Wind website, the Voice of Group of Forces North, provides us with a lengthy list of Ukrainian military equipment that has been destroyed, and says that over the last 24 hours, 200 Ukrainian troops were detected and destroyed. I presume that means killed, by the way. And then it goes on to say this: in all directions, the enemy increased the intensity of artillery shelling of our positions, mainly from mortars. Reconnaissance activities have intensified. This suggests that the Kiev regime's troops intend to launch a counteroffensive in the near future. And then there's a warning that there's going to be an enormous amount of disinformation about the situation from the Ukrainians before long, and that everyone should remain calm and critically evaluate the information and use only verified sources. So, what we've been told is that the Ukrainians do intend to conduct an offensive in the Kharkiv area, a counteroffensive, I should say, in the Kharkiv area. It's unclear what its intended scope is going to be, but for the moment at least, it is the Russians who are continuing to make progress. It is they who continue to gain more and more territory. I think that there is going to be a Ukrainian counterattack eventually. I've discussed it in previous programs. I expect when it happens that the Ukrainians will be very badly defeated indeed. It seems the military units that the Ukrainians have in this area are a hodgepodge of some very experienced units, but also barely trained ones. And the Russians seem to have complete aerial dominance. And even if the Mirage 2005s are delivered over the next few weeks, they will have the Russians almost certainly in this area close to Russia are going to retain it. And of course the Russians have very large forces just across the border. These are the heavy mechanized infantry with the tanks and the infantry fighting vehicles, and they have huge amounts of artillery, and they outgun the Ukrainians to an extraordinary degree. And I don't think that the situation is going to be changed, that the situation in Kharkiv region can be changed. I think that any Ukrainian counterattack is certain to fail. And for all I know, once it has failed, and the Russians do what they did in the autumn, which is start an offensive of their own, it could be that the gravely weakened Ukrainian forces are going to have even more difficulty holding the line against the Russians than they have had up to this time. And I, for one, would not be surprised if at that point the Russians perhaps do start seriously considering that which Putin has told us for the moment they have no plans for, which is an attack on Kharkiv itself. Just saying. Anyway, that's what we learn about the situation in Kharkiv. No other battlefront in the Ukraine war do we have such detailed accounts of the fighting from an official Russian source. And I'm going to say that I think one of the reasons why this is the case is that there has been a political decision made in Moscow, a political and military decision made in Moscow to give maximum amount of attention to this particular theatre. And I think the reason the Russians are doing that is because, again, they want to draw the Ukrainians as much as possible to focus on this particular area of the fighting. Because we are getting more and more information all the time about the situation elsewhere on the battlefronts, and it continues to go disastrously badly for Ukraine. Now, in Chasiv Yar, for example, we've had further confirmation that the Russians are indeed fighting to clear Kalinina, this village to the northwest of Chasiv Yar. It's clear that there are still Ukrainian troops there, but the Russians are attacking them with drones and bombs, and it looks as if this particular village is being stormed. Perhaps a lengthy battle, but the outcome is hardly in doubt. There doesn't seem to be any doubt at all, at least not in my mind, that the Russians are indeed west of the aqueduct in this area. We've also had pictures of the situation with the aqueduct on the southern flank of Chasiv Yar. And I should say that these pictures, photographs that I've seen, confirm a number of important things. Firstly, we are talking about an aqueduct, not a canal, and the water was indeed sent through this aqueduct via pipes. This is not a canal at all. If by canal we imagine something that looks like a river. This was a system of pipes which sometimes lay on the surface, sometimes went underground, and of course that does present an obstacle, but not an obstacle of the sort that a genuine canal would do. Anyway, these pictures show the pipe, the specific pipe in question, very clearly. They would also show something else, which also fully bears out something which another correspondent who contacted me on the Duran pointed out to me some weeks ago, which is that given the extent of the fighting that has taken place in this area, it is almost certain that the water pumps that sent water through the pipes that make up this aqueduct have been destroyed or are not operating. In which case, there is no water in these pipes. And in fact, there's been pictures of some kind of drone, I don't know whose side it is, in the area of on the southern flanks of Chasiv Yar, dropping grenades on the pipes, and it's clear that the pipes are indeed empty. Now, it seems to me that these pipes are in reality not much of an obstacle at all. Tanks and heavy vehicles could probably smash through them, that's my guess. They can certainly be destroyed, apparently, by relatively small grenades. And that means that this whole concept of a line of defense along these pipes is probably mistaken. Anyway, it seems that the Russians are indeed present west of this pipeline system, both north of Chasiv Yar and south of it. About information about what's going on in the micro-district, well, I have seen none. Now, Redovka, Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, has given us a very detailed discussion, very erudite discussion about the situation in the Siversk area. The long and the short of it is that the 106th Airborne Guards Division of the Russian Army, one of the most elite paratroop divisions in the Russian Army, is operating in this area and appears to be steadily gaining ground in this area also. It looks as if the Russians are indeed gradually closing the trap around Siversk. In the Ocheretino-Avdiivka area, there's been more pictures of the Russians destroying Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. I believe that at least one more Abrams tank was also destroyed in this area. It's extraordinary how routine the destruction of these American vehicles has now become on the battlefronts, how little attention it now attracts. But anyway, it's clear that in all of these places, Novo-Alexandrovka, Sokol, towards Kalinovka, in all of these places, the Russians continue to push forward. The Ukrainians have apparently now admitted further Russian advances in Krasnogorovka. The Ukrainians have apparently also admitted that the Russians are now in effective or indeed complete control of Staromayorsk. The Ukrainians are also admitting that the Russians have entered Konstantinovka, the village west of Novomikhailovka, the big village which brings the Russians not only astride the main road to Vuglidar, but also closer, ever closer to Kurachovo. And last night, apparently, there's few details about it, but the Russians conducted another massive, or at least big, missile strike all across Ukraine, continuing to inflict huge damage upon the Ukrainians, but this particular attack apparently focusing more on the military-industrial complex than on the energy system. An energy system which is now apparently close to collapse. Ukrainian officials apparently admitting that they will only be able to provide sporadic supplies of electricity during the winter. And there are admissions that this, together with the fact that more and more workers are being mobilized by Ukraine and sent off to the front, makes it seem that we are looking also at an implosion of such economic activity as still continues in Ukraine. It would not be surprising again at all to me if, with economic activity in Ukraine collapsing and with huge shortages of electric power, we started to see increasing pressure on Ukraine's currency over the course of the autumn and winter, despite the continued monetary infusions that the Western powers are making. And it seems to me that once again, there is a real threat of a spiral into, or a downward spiral into a state of hyperinflation in Ukraine. Now, it's not a prediction, but it does seem to me at least a possibility. Anyway, all of this, even as the Russian Economics Ministry is now revising upwards its expectations for economic growth in Russia this year. This is a report that's now come from Interfax, an Russian news agency which focuses heavily on economic questions and which is, by the way, as far as I know, entirely independent of the Russian government. It tells us Growth in Russia's GDP could exceed 3% in 2024. Deputy Chief of Staff of the Presidential Executive Office, Maxim Oreshkin, told journalists on the sidelines of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. We could grow by more than 3%, Oreshkin said. And Oreshkin also said that although Russia, according to the World Bank, had already reached fourth place in 2021, in other words, had overtaken Japan, in terms of the size of its economy, there are serious competitors, and this does not remove the task of maintaining this position through continued economic growth. We have very serious competitors, especially in the Southeast Asia, an economy like Indonesia, which is rapidly developing, actively developing. Southeast Asia is up and coming, and in this regard, we need to become better, progress strongly in order to maintain the positions that we have attained and have achieved. And then Interfax reports that the Economic Development Ministry estimates that the country's GDP, that Russia's GDP, grew 4.4% year on year in April, 4.2% in March, 7.6% in February, and 4.8% in January. And GDP growth was estimated by the Economics Ministry at 5.1% in January to April. I understand that that's been revised upwards, or perhaps May figures have been included. But at the moment, the view is the GDP growth this year for Russia up to now is 5.4%. GDP growth overall is going to be less than this over the course of this year, because from now on, Russian statistics are going to have to take into account the rise in economic activity that took place in June of last year, which will make the year-on-year increase in June seem lower than it did in May, April, March, February, and January. It'll be a pure statistical drop, though I suspect some people will try to make much of it. It's likely that, it's certain that inflation will fall, the headline inflation will fall for the same reason. Again, actual price growth in Russia remains high, but declining compared to the situation that existed last year, in the second half of last year. And that has caused the central bank to maintain, they've announced today, that they are maintaining their prime rate at 16%, which is what everybody expected that they would do. In the meantime, both the Economics Ministry and the central bank have upgraded their overall expectations for growth. Oreshkin said that it might be over 3%, but the Economics Ministry has upgraded its growth estimate to 2.8% from September's estimate of 2.3%. The central bank has actually shown greater optimism. They're saying that growth this year could be in a range 2.5% to 3.5%, and that's a sharp upgrade from earlier estimates by the central bank, which had predicted growth this year of between 1 and 2%. So, sharp upgrades in Russia's growth rates for this year. And another Russian official, this is the Russian energy minister. Well, he's a deputy prime minister, actually, but he has overall responsibility for the energy complex. And this is Alexander Novak. He too has taken an optimistic view of the prospects of the economy. he said that goals of 2.8 to 3% economic growth are absolutely achievable and higher growth is possible. The government should offer terms that would create both confidence and comfortable conditions to business. And I suspect that we are going to see a sustained growth rate of around 3%, probably around this year, probably for a few years beyond that. And then, quite possibly, we might see growth grow higher still. But as to why I think that, that is a topic for another day. This is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop where you will find a whole magnificent range of products celebrating Football 24. And there's a discount, I believe, as well. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.